If you've ever wondered what it was like in the Wild Wild West, don't worry, you're not alone. I can't say I've ever thought of being like a Western gal, but after watching stereotypes come to life in old movies, I'm quite curious about the truth versus the fiction. Let's lasso up some facts together, shall we? Please don't click off, I promise I'll stop with the bad jokes. When a story attracted public anger, some settlers in the West were quick to take the law into their own hands. These vigilantes were idolized in popular contemporary accounts, but the justice they served was often brutal and inhumane by most standards. Not content with apprehension and execution, most vigilantes physically tormented any accused. Some folks even took trophies. In 1891, the skin of a sentenced bandit was tanned and made into souvenirs. It's definitely more unique than the usual tacky magnets or door signs, I'll give them that. Vigilantes justified their acts by pointing to the terrible acts that the accused had allegedly committed. Yeah, but to quote my dad, two wrongs don't make a right. Even when the accused were caught and were waiting for trial, vigilante squads didn't always have the patience to wait for a legal sentence or risk an acquittal. Instead, they showed up at the jail and demanded to deal with the offenders themselves. In one 1878 incident, an accused killer was caught, taken to jail, with a trial scheduled for the next day. But during that night, 20 or 30 masked men arrived with weapons in hand and took the man away to deliver their own immediate justice. How? Well, they killed this guy by way of the rope necklace of death. Look, that guy probably wasn't long for this world anyways, since most convictions at the time ended in executions. The life expectancy of somebody who broke the law in the Wild Wild West often decreased dramatically after conviction, especially for those accused of taking another person's life. Whether offenders received an official trial or one carried out by the unsanctioned vigilantes, folks demanded justice. In California, offenders were convicted in very quick trials and usually met the end of their life at the county courthouse. Execution usually came shortly after conviction, as appeals and stays of execution were uncommon. If an expected execution did not happen or did not occur quickly enough for the crowd, that's where you've got your vigilantes that I was speaking about a moment ago. I know in one 1851 case, vigilantes convicted a man of stealing gold dust and gave him a simple little 3 hours to get his affairs in order before they ended his life. Like, I don't know about you, but that's not enough time to get my affairs in order. I have too much junk. Law enforcement was still a job during vigilante time, but death in the line of duty was pretty likely. The West had a variety of legitimate lawmen, ranging from town sheriffs and marshals to the U.S. Marshals appointed by the Attorney General. U.S. Marshals were charged with maintaining federal law, and they could deputize local men to form a posse when greater numbers were necessary. And during this period, deaths in the line of duty were kinda common. The U.S. Marshals alone had several deadly incidents. In 1872, a marshal and 7 members of his posse were fatally harmed when they tried to take a prisoner from the custody of another court. In 1885, a deputy marshal and 3 members of his posse engaged in a deadly firing exchange. A prisoner escape claimed the lives of a deputy marshal and 2 posse members in 1887. Another did the same to 2 deputy marshals and 1 posse member in 1893. The West still holds a lot of records for the deadliest incidents involving multiple law enforcement casualties. Not records I want to see broken anytime soon, mind you. Contrary to what you might think after all that, many towns did indeed try to enforce weapon control and restrictions. The Wild West had no shortage of fireable weapons, creating a worrying situation for lawmen trying to prevent violent offenses. Towns like Tombstone, Arizona, and Dodge City, Kansas required visitors to surrender their weapons whenever they entered the town. In fact, the 1881 firing exchange event at the OK Corral started as a conflict over Billy Clanton and the McLaury brothers refusing to give up their weapons when they entered Tombstone. Anyone defying a western town's weapon control laws was likely to meet a violent end. Author and cowboy Andy Adams describes the laws of Dodge City in his account published in 1903. The buffalo hunters and rangemen have protested against the iron rule of Dodge's peace officers, and nearly every protest has cost human life. Don't ever get the impression that you can ride your horses into a saloon or fire out the lights in Dodge. It may go somewhere else, but it don't go there. Most cowboys think it's an infringement on their rights to give up firing in town, and if it is, it stands. For your weapons are no match for Winchesters and buckshot, and Dodge's officers are as game a set of men as ever faced danger. Look, I know weapons control is something law enforcement still struggles to enforce till this day, so interesting to see how that goes. So even with law enforcement being a thing, corruption was kinda rampant. The West had many problems with vigilante justice, but the legitimate lawmen were sometimes not much better. Many law enforcement officers were not consistently paid, earning money only through taking a percentage of fines or collecting bounties on wanted men. In desperate times, some lawmen turned to crime themselves, making corruption a big problem. Sheriff Dave Allison was accused several times of misappropriation of money. Henry Newton Brown was a deputy sheriff tasked with tracking people for a bounty, but on his bounty hunt, he robbed a bank with 3 accomplices. A vigilante mob took matters into their own hands though, enacting fatal punishment. So he did get punished, quote unquote. Timothy Longhaired Jim Courtright used his position in law enforcement to run a protection racket that extorted profits from gambling dens and saloons. He died in a duel with somebody else though. Who else? Oh, just a saloon owner who refuses protection. Sadly, racism was a big influence for a lot of crime and crime punishments. In 1862, a period of famine and encroaching white settlement led to conflict between the Sante Sioux and the US military under the direction of General John Pope. When the conflict ended a few months later, hundreds of indigenous folks were taken prisoner and sentenced to death in military trials that lasted around 10 minutes each, so not really long. Most of these prisoners were convicted on the basis of being present when the fighting ended, which, great, let's kill all of our bystanders for no reason. Military authorities wanted to execute all 303 people who were convicted, but President Abraham Lincoln was concerned with distinguishing between individual acts and group warfare, and how executing prisoners of war would look to foreign powers. He approved the execution of only 38 prisoners in the end, still making it the largest mass execution in US history. This was far from the end of indiscriminate executions, as the US government enforced increasingly dehumanizing policies. Generals William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan fought against indigenous groups, viewing those conflicts with the same attitude of total war that they had adopted during the Civil War. Under their direction, the military destroyed entire villages, with Sherman ordering his soldiers to kill everybody in a village and burn it down. And that's just the official folks. Vigilante justice was inherently subject to the biases of the public, which often led to the racially motivated selection of targets. And the West was no exception, with plenty of ethnic minorities considered the other and regarded as a threat by white settlers. So, folks who were Hispanic, indigenous, and Chinese were frequent targets of vigilante acts. In 1878, Juan de la Cruz was accused of attacking a woman and a young human, well, boozing. The victims were unharmed in the incident, but public anger turned against La Cruz and a mob seized the attacker from jail, and he met his way by the end of the rope necklace. When the body was found, one witness reportedly said, "You've done a good job, you reformers. Now why don't you hang the man who sold the whiskey to the Indian?" His words, not mine, but it just gives you an idea of how things were at the time. Ever heard of Army Camels? So in 1855, the US Army decided to import camels to Texas. The wide open spaces of the West were well suited for them, so they were like, yeah, let's bring in 75 camels from the Middle East. They worked at Camp Verde, where they made supply runs to San Antonio. But a few years later, the Civil War disrupted the service when a government official decided to auction off the animal, and the new owners sent some of them to Nevada, some to California, and other ones were just sort of set free. Now at first you didn't really see them around, but in the 1880s, Arizona Territory faced a terrible menace known as the Red Ghost. What did it do? Well, it trampled one woman, whereas another story claimed the monster ate a grizzly bear. When miners spotted the Red Ghost and fired at it, a human skull fell from the creature's back. After years of terrorizing Arizona, eventually it was taken out. What was it? Just a feral camel. Now camel sightings in the West continued into the 20th century, which is so wild. Like imagine just going about your day, damn, a camel. Time to talk about a famous criminal. Billy the Kid was wanted in 1881 for shooting a sheriff in Nebraska and another man in a New Mexico saloon. Running from a $500 bounty on his head, he was eventually trapped and put on trial. And it didn't go the way he wanted. The judge found Billy guilty, saying the outlaw would hang until he was dead, dead, dead. Billy responded, "You can go to hell, hell, hell." How poetic. His date with the gallows set, Billy pulled off a daring escape. On April 28th of 1881, he asked the deputy guarding his jail cell to take him to the outhouse. Once free from the cell, the outlaw pulled off his handcuffs, took the deputy's firearm, and did away with the deputy. Knowing the sheriff would be after him, Billy hid on the roof of the courthouse. When the sheriff ran up, Billy yelled, "Look up, old boy, and see what you get," and then fired on the sheriff. His escape nearly complete, he took a horse and hit the road and got away. Well, that time. We all know how the rest of the story played out. Feuding families were a doozy and a half back in the day. The Kentucky-West Virginia border's world-famous Hatfield and McCoy families weren't the only notorious feuding clans of the old days. In fact, the Old West had a feud that went even further than that infamous incident. After the Civil War, Texas had two families, the Suttons and the Taylors, who really didn't like each other. The feud started when Buck Taylor fired at and killed a Sutton Alley in 1866, then escalated with the deaths of Taylor and a man named Dick Chisholm. 2 years later, in a horse sale gone wrong, Taylor's remaining family members dug in their heels. They had Southern pride and were mad about the Confederacy losing decisively in the Civil War. The Suttons, meanwhile, had the backing of local Texas militia members and state police outfits that were keen on Reconstruction. The Sutton family's patriarch, William, took control of the police himself by 1869, running raids across the state to ferret out cattle rustlers sympathetic to the Taylors. Over the next 5 years, all of DeWitt County, Texas was plunged into a horrifically violent feud. Even members of other families were forced to take sides and choose. Those who didn't offer allegiance risked being killed. Then again, those who did pick a team were killed in skirmishes and senseless violence as well. By 1874, so many people had died in DeWitt County that the Texas Rangers finally rode in and worked for months to ease tensions. They were mostly unsuccessful, but by the end of 1875, the feud started to slow down. And it wasn't because of anybody's really great negotiating skills. It was just because the most aggressive and vicious participants on each side had met their end. Because of everything else I've already covered today, it should come as a surprise to nobody that homicide rates in the Wild West were extremely high, rivaled only by the violence of the American South during the Civil War and Reconstruction. An adult living in Dodge City, Kansas from 1876 to 1885 stood a 1 in 61 chance of not surviving. If you lived in San Francisco, you had a 1 in 203 chance of a similarly rough end, and if you lived in other counties in California, 1 in 72. Oregon? 1 in 208. Still not great, but not awful. And that's it from me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee. But the justice they had... Because of everything I've covered today, it should come to... I feel like we're missing some of that. Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay. Alright, we just need the families. There we go, there we go. Sorry, editor.